There's often some debate about whether a camera can be professional or not. Usually that comes down to the features that it has rather than the specs. And some of those features can be very, very useful and are seen on those higher end cameras. Some of those features are starting to come down into the more consumer level affordable cameras like the Sony FX30 that I've got here. And we're going to talk about whether some of them are worth it or not. Now, the first one, and this is something that the FX30 actually has, and that is dual card slots. With most mirrorless style cameras, this is technically a mirrorless camera, even though Sony kind of calls it a cinema camera, you put your SD cards in the side. Now, Sony has been doing CF Express Type A cards for a while, and they actually have this really cool dual CF Express Type A and SD card slot, so you can have either type of card in the same slot. Right now, I've got two CF Express cards in here. This is from ProGrade. Thanks, ProGrade, for sending me these cards. It's a 960 gig CF Express Type A card, and it has a maximum read speed of 1800 megabytes per second. So that's very, very fast. The other one I have in there is a 160 gig Lexar CF Express Type A card, because that's what I was using before I got the ProGrade ones. And when it comes to the reasons to have dual card slots, I feel like the main reason that most people would use it is redundancy. And that is one of probably the most common uses for having multiple cards, because if you do have a card or whatever media you're recording to, whether it's a, basically an SSD like in really high-end cameras, or even if you're using SD cards, if you can have two cards in there, you can record the exact same thing to both of those cards at the same time. So if one of your cards corrupts, I've personally never had a card fail on me, but I have heard it can happen, and you don't really want to be in a situation where you shoot something really important and then your card corrupts. I have been in a situation where I was shooting on a Red Komodo X and the camera died because the battery died mid-take, and we thought the card had been corrupted and we'd lost everything from that day. Turns out it was only just that last take that it, missed because it was currently recording. It didn't manage to save that file, but the rest of it ended up being fine. But that's sort of a downside to having only one card slot like the Reds do. They only have that one CF Express Type B slot. So if you do have something bad happen like that, like the battery dying or the card itself just corrupting, then you at least have a backup, hopefully. There's a few other ways to use dual card slots like this. In hybrid cameras, for example, like the A7 IV that I'm shooting on now, or even on the FX30, you can change in the settings to set videos to record to one card and photos to record to the other card, which can be very helpful if you are a hybrid shooter and you want your organization later on to be very easy. You take one card out, it's only got videos on it, and one card has got only photos on it. Dual card slots can also mean you can just have longer recording times. Now, with the 960 gig card that I've got in there now, I can record 14 hours of 10-bit 422 4K 25 frames per second video in XAVC-S. Obviously, if I was shooting an SI, it wouldn't be as high because the bitrate's higher, but 14 hours is a lot. So I don't really need to use the rollover function, but it means if that first card does get full, it automatically starts recording on the second card. So then you can then swap out the first one and you kind of never have to stop. So if you had a bunch of smaller cards, theoretically, you could still just keep going and rolling them over from one to the other and then swap the one that's not being written to. That can be very helpful if you do have smaller cards. With bigger cards like this, you don't really need that. And I feel like bigger cards are kind of better. Like, I'd rather have just a big capacity so I don't have to worry about that, because there's no way I'm going to shoot 14 hours of content on any single shoot without backing it up, and then I can format the card. Certain cameras can also utilize having two cards by writing the video files themselves, the actual full resolution and full bitrate files, to one card, and then proxies to a second card. So then you can edit with the proxies, and then you can do the whole proxy workflow from the start. You don't have to make proxies because you can record them directly onto a separate card. And I feel like that would probably be the best way to do it if you have two different cards in your camera. Like what you can do in the FX30 is you can have a CF Express Type A card in either slot and an SD card in either slot. So you can have one of each, or two of one, or two of the other. So if you do have an SD card that's maybe not quite fast enough to keep up with the full size files, then you could just record proxies to that. Some cameras have like a CF Express Type B and then an SD card as their second slot, which Nikon, Canon, why do you do that? I don't get why. Just like put two of the same slots in there. The SM4 even has one CF Express Type A and SD card slot, and then a second only SD card slot. I can't even put a second CF Express Type A card in the A7 IV, which is a little bit annoying because now I actually have 4. So now I just have one sitting in my bag. It's only 80 gigs, so it's not a big deal, but it just means I have to have a SD card in there when I'd rather have a CF Express Type A. Now, is having dual card slots necessary to make it a professional camera? Technically, no, because, Reds are very professional level cameras and they don't have dual card slots, but there's definitely benefits to having it. And when you're shooting stuff that's really important that you don't want to lose, then it's kind of something you don't want to risk. So I would say, unless you're getting a Red, for example, if you're getting any camera at a level where you're doing that sort of work, get a camera with dual card slots. Okay, the next one is SDI. Now, this is a feature that the FX30 does not have. It only has an HDMI port, but I have been using SDI on my monitor to my wireless transmission system since I got the Portkeys HS8 and HoloLens Pyro S. They both have SDI, so that means I can take a 3G SDI cable, this one right here from Condor Blue. It's a nice short one, it's like a foot, I think, or even less. So it's just nice and compact, very thin, and just goes out of the, well, right now I'm actually monitoring this camera. So I've actually got the receiver here, SDI cable going into the monitor, so then I can see my image on this one. And then one thing that I actually have but haven't got to use yet really is this 12G SDI cable from Condor Blue. The reason is because I don't have a camera that has SDI, so I only need one cable at the moment between these two devices here, and the monitor itself can only do 3G, so I don't really need the bigger, heavier duty cable. But this is a little bit thicker than the 3G version, and it's just a lot more robust. So if I was to get like an FX6 or something like that, then I would definitely use this to go straight into the monitor, or maybe even straight into the wireless system to have a better signal to go out rather than the 3G version. But why is SDI an industry standard? And I think the main reason is because it's just a better connector. It uses the BNC connector, and it's a lock-in connector, which HDMI is not. On cameras like this, you can get HDMI clamps like this one here. I talked about this in my most recent video about the SmallRig and tilter cages for the FX30. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. This is sort of not necessary when it comes to SDI because the connector themselves lock. Basically, you press it onto the connector and then you push and twist, and then it locks in and it can't come undone. But then when you do want it coming undone, you push and twist and it's really easy to just take off. So it's just a better connector overall, and you're never gonna yank out an SDI cable, whereas you could yank out an HDMI cable. HDMI can also like wiggle in the port. Like if I undo this clamp, there's a bit of movement in that cable there just within the port. That's not gonna happen with SDI. Now the one downside to SDI is there is a little bit of an issue when it comes to the power, because there is a slight risk that you can kill SDI ports in cameras, for example, if you plug things in the wrong order and power them in the wrong order. Now, if you use very high quality stuff, it shouldn't be an issue, but even ARRI recommends you still only plug in your SDI cable after you've plugged in and powered on the devices. So you would power on everything, and then you would plug in your SDI cable to your camera to your monitor. So the general rule is like last in, first out. So when you are rigging up or de-rigging your camera, the SDI is always the last thing to go when you're building it and the first thing to get unplugged when you're taking it apart. I don't really get why they haven't sort of fixed that issue, but it's also not necessarily that big of an issue with high quality stuff like shielded cables and stuff like that. But it's just sort of a risk that, it's easy enough to avoid that you just sort of do it in that order. But other than that, like SDI is just better in every way. Also, if you are unfamiliar, the numbers with like 3G, 6G, 12G, that is the amount of data that can pass through per second. I'm pretty sure it'd either be gigabit or gigabyte. I'll put on the screen. So obviously a 12G SDI cable will be able to carry a stronger signal So if you have a really high resolution or high frame rate or just a higher bit rate video in general, you're going to want a higher number before that G in your SDI cable. For general monitoring and stuff though, 3G is totally fine because most monitors really only display 1080p. But for example, if you want to record externally via SDI in like 4K 30, 4K 60, higher resolutions even, you're probably going to want to go with 12G over 3G, which, you know, the cable's going to be more expensive because they're better, obviously. Related to SDI, because they use the same connector, the next thing we're going to talk about is timecode. Now, timecode usually on cinema cameras, like let's say an FX6 or a Red or something like that, they're going to use that same BNC connector that SDI uses. And timecode is going to be used much more on, you know, higher level productions, particularly productions that use multicam, or at least use separate video and audio recording, because, you know, you don't want to have to sync a bunch of cameras and a bunch of audio manually if you don't have to. So how timecode works is usually you'll see on cameras, you'll have a little clock running sort of thing in your NLE as well. In DaVinci Resolve, when you're editing, it'll have that timecode as well. And basically what a timecode generator does is it generates a very accurate signal to put out to all of your devices. And then because of all those devices being synced basically while they're shooting, it's really easy to sync them in post. You just go select them, sync by timecode, and they're all just perfectly in sync, assuming timecode works properly. Whereas if you have to either sync it manually or sync it by waveform, sync by waveform can be pretty good, but it can often be like a little bit out. And then syncing manually just takes more time. So if you can sync it all automatically, way better. Now, while I don't have any timecode specific devices like a Deity timecode slate or even like the TC1s that Deity has, I do have the Rode Wireless Pro, which does have some timecode features. How I'm running this now is I've set the timecode mode to have the audio of my lav mic here to go in the first channel or the left channel to have the merged audio. If I was using both of the transmitters, it would have just both of those audio signals going into one channel. And then in the right channel, we have the timecode. So it is sending the timecode signal into the camera. So that means that both the audio from the pack that's on me now and the camera should be the same, so I can just sync it really easily in post. And anyone that has ever started using timecode always says, why didn't I do this earlier? Like, it's just so much easier. And I believe them. I just haven't really got onto that quite yet because I haven't got any like timecode specific gear to do that. But especially if I start doing much more multicam stuff, it's definitely going to be something I'll invest into. Or if a company like Deity wants to send me some timecode stuff, you can contact me somehow. And then the last feature on cinema cameras that I'm going to talk about in this video at least is internal NDs. And I've mentioned the FX6 a bunch of times because I think it is sort of the most logical progression, at least for me, from the FX30, and I have wanted the FX6 for ages, but it has probably one of the best internal ND systems. And again, if you're unsure, an ND is a neutral density filter, which basically just darkens your entire image. Right now I've got a 4-stop ND on there because I'm shooting at like T2.2 or something, and my lights are on relatively bright, but I have a filter on the front, and just like on this camera too, I have a matte box with an ND filter that you can see here. I'm gonna change that, see if you can actually see the difference. And then you should be able to see that difference there. That's me changing the ND externally. This is the Tilta Mirage with the built-in VND that it can sort of come with. It's like a 1 to 9 stop. But the downside to VNDs normally are they are two circular polarizers that rotate in front of each other. That's how VNDs generally work. But the FX6, and I think the FX9 as well, and the Burano actually, they have this electronic VND system, which rather than having circular polarizers that rotate in front of each other, because that actually causes issues because it's doing polarization at the same time, and sometimes you don't want that polarization, or maybe you want to be able to control that separately, so that's a whole different thing. Whereas with an electronic VND, you just add a different amount of voltage to that sheet of glass, and then it'll make it darker or not. And then in cameras like the FX6, you can, you know, set it to auto, and you can have it gradual, you can have it in steps. So it's just a lot easier to use than having an external filter on the front of your camera, or even one in the back of your lens or in your adapter or whatever you're using. And again, that's one of those things that when people switch to using a system like that, they're like, why doesn't every camera have this? Because it's just so helpful. And of course, even if 7 stops isn't enough, you can just add more on the front, add like a 1 stop or 2 stop or 3 stop ND on the front, or even a variable for some reason if you wanted to do that. But there's basically no downsides apart from maybe some like IR pollution or some color casting. And of course the body would need to be slightly bigger, and it does cause some issues with stabilization because the Burano, I think, is the only camera that I know of that has both in-body stabilization and an internal ND filter. But cinema cameras generally don't have IBIS anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. But internal NDs is something that I've been hearing people say they want in an FX3 Mark II, which I totally get, but I can't see Sony doing that because I can't see them making the FX3 Mark II bigger than the FX3, and that would sort of need to happen to fit that mechanism inside that body. Whereas the FX6 is big enough, you can just keep it in there. So FX6 Mark II, well, first of all, actually, the FX6 already has all these features that I've talked about, so it doesn't even matter. It just needs a 3.5mm audio jack. Now, there are, of course, other professional level features that can make cinema cameras, or pro cameras. But that's all I'm going to talk about today. Let me know what other features you think would fit in this category and if they're worth it or not. There's some links in the description to talk about some of the things I said, Kondo Blue cables and whatnot. There's links to SmallRig and MusicBed down there as well. Go watch another video over here, and I'll see you next time. Do all the other things. Okay, bye.